Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Let your arms go heavy, your breath slow. And as you listen, feel free to leave a comment sharing what time it is, where you are, and what city or village you're listening from. It's love to know. And if you'd like more quiet stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe so they gently appear when you need them most. Now, let's begin. In the Turkish region of Cappadocia, the ground breathes in silence. You see jagged cliffs and strange rock chimneys above, painted in the pale tones of sunrise, sandy yellow, rose blush, and dry gray. But beneath your feet, a shadowed world waits. You wouldn't notice it at first, not unless someone showed you a small, round stone door tucked behind an old stable, or unless a curious villager broke through a basement wall and found not bedrock, but air-cold, stale, and wide as a street. This is where it began in modern times. A man trying to expand his cellar in the 1960s accidentally rediscovered something the world had forgotten for centuries. What he found wasn't a single chamber. It was a city, but not like Pompeii or Troy or even Petra. This was no ruin carved into the side of a mountain. This was beneath the mountain. Derinkuye, 20 levels deep in some places, roughly 60 meters below the surface. A place built not for worship or trade, but for survival. Quiet, invisible survival at first glance. The layout looks chaotic, cramped, stairwells winding down through dark shafts, sometimes so narrow that only one person can pass at a time. But then you notice something else. There are kitchens here, wine presses, stables, entire family rooms with air vents carved upward like volcanic chimneys, and ventilation shafts so precisely aligned that, even at the lowest levels, people could breathe. Historians estimate Derinkuye could shelter 15,000 to 20,000 people along with their livestock, grain, and water for months. This wasn't a cave. It was a fortress, a last breath against extinction. And it wasn't alone. Across Cappadocia, more than 200 underground cities have been discovered, most small, some deep, some shallow, and many interconnected through secret tunnel systems. But Derinkuye remains the largest and deepest of them all, the grand central artery of a civilization that preferred to hide in stone rather than face what chased them above. Who built it? The truth is, we're not entirely sure. Some scholars argue the Phrygians began carving it as early as the 8th century BCE, using primitive iron tools to cut through soft volcanic tufa type of rock, easy to carve, when dry but strong enough to hold shape once set. Others believe the Hittites dug its first chambers even earlier, retreating underground during tribal invasions. But the version we now walk through, multi-leveled, is carefully engineered, capable of long-term occupation, appears to be the work of Byzantine Christians sometime between the 5th and 10th centuries CE. They expanded older chambers, added chapels, built baptismal pools, and etched crosses into doorways. Why? Because enemies kept coming. Arabs, Persians, later, Seljuk Turks. This was a region always shifting, always caught between empires, above ground. The wind might carry the sounds of conquest. Below, there was only stillness. Imagine the descent. You walk down through a hidden entrance, perhaps concealed behind a stable wall or a stone slab. You carry no torch. Only a small oil lamp flickers in your hand. The passage is narrow, your shoulders scrape both sides. There are no handrails, no steps as you know them, only smooth grooves and sudden slopes. After the 3rd or 4th level, the silence thickens, and then, just as your knees begin to ache from the squat of descent to, enter a room wide enough for 50 people. Smells of dust, metal, and ash. On one wall is a flat niche, perhaps where grain was stored. On another, a chimney you can't see the top of. Somewhere far above, light filters through. Somewhere far below, people may already be gathered. You've entered a society that planned for the worst and did so with remarkable skill. What makes Doringyu so strange isn't just its scale, it's the precision. Massive rolling stone doors, each weighing up to 1,000 pounds, could be pushed from the inside to seal off passageways. Once shut, they couldn't be opened from the outside. And unlike traditional doors, they weren't vertical. They were shaped like millstones, sliding into place horizontally across tunnel mouths. Some passageways were so narrow that a single armed guard could hold off attackers for hours. There were traps, false tunnels, wells hidden deep within the city that didn't connect to surface water so its enemies couldn't poison them. Air shafts cleverly disguised, and rooms shaped to reduce smoke buildup and allow for cooking even in full lockdown. But here's the mystery. Doringyu was not a one-time hiding place. It was reused over centuries, across empires, through religion, famine, fear, and drought, and every time left behind almost nothing. No monuments, no royal tombs, just signs of people who didn't want to be seen. It is, in many ways, the inverse of a city. Not a place meant to attract or celebrate, but a place meant to disappear, take thousands of lives with it. Not to death, but to silence. There's one room on the 5th level that scholars believe was used as a school. Nearby, a chamber with a raised dais may have functioned as a church or meeting hall. The acoustics are surprisingly good. You could speak in a low voice and be heard 20 meters away. And yet, there are no names, no writings, no personal histories etched into the wall. It's as though the people of Doringyu intended to be forgotten, or perhaps feared what remembering would cost. Some archaeologists suggest the tunnels weren't only for war or defense. They may also have served as seasonal shelters, places to escape Anatolia's scorching summers or bitter winters. The rock held steady temperatures year-round, averaging around 13 degrees Celsius, 55 degrees Fahrenheit, no matter what happened outside. Others argue for a more spiritual motive. In Cappadocian tradition, even today, the underworld is not just a place of fear. It is a place of waiting, of protection, a womb of stone where the faithful endure until the light returns. So, when a city is buried not by accident, but by design, what does that mean? Were they hiding from the world, or preparing to outlast it? Doringyu was abandoned gradually, like many ancient cities. No cataclysm, no violent end, just a slow forgetting. By the 20th century, most locals knew the caves existed, but not their full extent. They were used as cellars, storage pits, even animal pens, until that 1963 rediscovery cracked open a wall, and the full history tumbled out. Today, tourists walk through its lighted corridors, guided by handrails and plaques, but the deepest levels remain closed. Too unstable, too dark, perhaps even too sacred. So we're left wondering, why did so many people choose to live a life hidden in stone? And what else still waits down there, beyond the last sealed door? If you had descended those tunnels in the year 750 CE, the silence would not have meant absence. The deeper you went, the more signs of life you would have heard. Children's soft questions echoing off limestone, the shuffle of sandals against stone, the clatter of clay vessels being stacked or cleaned. Quiet was survival, but silence was never total. Beneath the surface, Doringyu had rhythms of its unsubdued, muted, reverent to the stone that cradled it. What strikes historians is not just the scale of Doringyu, but the normalcy within it. People didn't merely hide there, they lived. For days, weeks, possibly even months at a time. And they did so with a kind of resigned practicality that suggests this was not panic-driven improvisation, but a way of life. Prepared, rehearsed, and passed down. If the enemy was seen on the horizon, entire villages could vanish in less than an hour. And when you pictured that goats guided down spiraling ramps, women carrying sacks of barley, toddlers bundled in blankets, elderly men descending with a careful foot on worn grooves. It paints a different portrait than most histories offer. Not soldiers, not kings, but families. Entire communities folding themselves into the earth-like roots inside Deringu. Everything had its place. On the second level, you'll find what appears to be a stable complete with low troughs carved directly into the walls, in ventilation, slits angled to remove the ammonia-laced breath of animals. The livestock were typically brought in first. They provided food, warmth, even waste for compost. Then came the people, organized by family, craft, or faith. Rooms were clustered around common areas, many connected to a central vertical shaft. The shaft served as both a ventilation corridor and a well, allowing the distribution of air and water vertically across the entire city. Engineers of the time had to calculate how air would move through long, narrow tunnels, adjusting shaft width and placement to keep it breathable below. They did this without the instruments we take for granted today. No anemometers, no thermometers, just centuries of accumulated wisdom carved into memory and stone. There was no plumbing in the modern sense, of course, but there were systems for waste disposal. Deeper chambers were often designated for latrines, with careful angling so that waste would not contaminate drinking water or nearby dwellings. Dry toilets and soil management were the norm. In some sections, archaeologists found compost pits, evidence of an early understanding of sustainability in closed environments. But what did people do while they were down there? They worked, they worshipped, and they waited. One chamber, clearly, larger and different in tone, is believed to have been a religious space, a chapel, perhaps. The walls are carved with crosses, and a basin thought to be used for baptisms still remains. Unlike the more utilitarian chambers, this one has smoother walls and a raised apse-like niche. It was likely not only a place of prayer, but also of communal gatherings, where people were reminded why they endured this underground world in the first place. Elsewhere, you'll find evidence of workshops, small rooms with raised benches, and shallow basins. They may have been used for grinding grain, preparing food, or dyeing cloth. Women likely managed these operations while also caring for the children who roamed the safer chambers. Men, depending on the era, may have taken turns guarding the tunnel mouths or maintaining the stone doors. Fire was used sparingly. Lamps fueled by animal fat or olive oil were the primary source of light. But smoke accumulation had to be controlled. This is why rooms were shaped in domed ceilings or angled chimneys to allow smoke to rise and be drawn up through vertical shafts. It was not comfortable by today's standards, but it was survivable. There's a reason the people of Deringu didn't etch their names into the walls or leave grand records of their lives. They didn't see this as history. They saw it as a pause. Life underground was not the main life. It was a mode of waiting, of passing time until the surface could be claimed again. And like so many things in history, the people who made it didn't think they were making anything remarkable. They believed they were simply enduring, which makes the story even more powerful, because history so often celebrates expansion of empires, cities, monuments. But Deringu was an act of contraction, of folding in, of enduring by withdrawal. It was survival through invisibility, and that requires a different kind of strength. Let's imagine a moment, a late evening, deep in Deringu, perhaps around 10 p.m., under the low flicker of a lantern. A man sits near the center of a family chamber, sharpening a bone needle. His wife patches a threadbare tunic by his side. Two children sleep, curled in wool cloaks, while a third hums a melody, too quiet to remember, above them. The world continues. Invaders may raid a nearby surface village, or pass entirely, never realizing what lies beneath. But down here, time thickens. Sound dies in soft waves against a rock, and life goes on. A quiet meal is shared. Grain stored from seasons past is cooked in a shallow clay pot. A whisper of salt, a handful of dried fruit. There's no luxury, but there is enough. Enough to last until the riders leave, or the frost passes, or the skies clear. Enough to keep the memory of sunlit life alive. And here's something else that's easy to miss. There was no real ownership underground. Rooms weren't marked by names. Tunnels weren't named for heroes. Spaces were shared. Occupancy shifted depending on need. And because Daring Q was never a royal city, never ruled by a single dynasty or nation state, there were few hierarchies. It was an equalizer. The rich and the poor lived in the same stone. The merchant and the shepherd took the same winding path downward. And maybe that's why there are no plaques, no records, no graves, because the moment people went below, they left identity behind. They became a community of ghosts in waiting. In the centuries that followed, K. Sydney and its sister cities were abandoned not because they failed, K, but because the need for them faded. The empires changed, threats evolved, and slowly life returned to the surface. By the Ottoman period, the underground cities had become storage pits, secret hideaways, and sources of village legend. Some believed jinn lived below. Others spoke of old saints buried in hidden chapels. And some children dared each other to enter and swiftly ran out, swearing they heard breathing in the rock. It wasn't until the 1960s that the full scale of Daring Q came back into focus. Local authorities began excavating. Historians followed. Today, less than half of it is open to the public. The deepest tunnels remain closed for safety or secrecy, and no one knows exactly how many more chambers remain hidden beyond the ones already found. There's a final theory that persists among some scholars. It suggests that Daring Q is not just a response to invasion, but to climate. Some believe periodic droughts, famines, or even ancient dust storms may have driven entire communities underground not for war, but for weather. If true, it would mean the tunnels were less of a panic room and more of an ark of steady refuge through cyclical disasters. But whether driven by war, wind, or worship, one truth remains. The people of Daring Q built downward, not upward. They fled neither forward nor outward, but inward, into the stone, into silence, and into a history that barely noticed them. So, we ask again, standing at the mouth of a darkened tunnel, was this city buried to be hidden, or to be remembered in a different way? In modern times, when tourists walk the narrow halls of Daring Q, they often speak in hushed tones, almost instinctively. Something about the place demands quiet. It isn't just the echo or the oppressive press of stone above. It's the memory of lives once lived here, hidden beneath the Anatolian soil. There's a sense of trespass. It's like you've stepped into the unfinished sentence of someone else's life, and the sentence was never meant to be loud. If you listen long enough, silence begins to shift. Tea no longer feels empty, but layered, as if thousands of breaths, held and exhaled, have soaked into the rock. Daring Q does not tell its story with inscriptions or murals. It tells it through absence, through the blank walls, the smooth stone, and the decisions not to decorate, not to mark, not to celebrate, only to endure. That's what makes Daring Q so strange in the history of human settlement. Most ancient cities announce themselves. Temples rise, walls boast, names are carved, gods invoked, but not here. This was a city that whispered. Its builders chose to leave no trail, no tribute, no name etched into eternity. And that's the point. Daring Q's story is not about power or conquest. It is about retreat, preservation, and anonymity. Even the entrances are designed to be forgotten. Many of them were once sealed with massive stone doors, circular slabs weighing hundreds of kilograms, rolled into place from inside. they could be opened only with leverage from within, making it impossible for pursuers to follow. And most of these entrances were cleverly disguised, hidden behind barns, beneath homes, under trapdoors, or buried beneath natural rockfall. Were so subtle, they were only discovered in the 20th century, when renovations accidentally exposed them. And those doors were not just physical barriers. They were psychological ones. They marked a threshold from open skies to closed stone, from freedom to shelter, from the known world into the world beneath it. Once sealed, the people of Daring Q were completely cut off from the surface. But even in this subterranean exile, life had its rhythms. In one chamber, a long, narrow room with shallow alcoves, archaeologists believe schooling may have taken place. Simple lessons, scripture, arithmetic, perhaps even instruction on survival and faith. These weren't grand classrooms, but modest spaces, shaped more by need than design. In another, carved shelves and stone bins suggest food storage, grains sealed in clay, jars of preserved fruit or pickled vegetables, goat's milk dried and rehydrated as needed. This was a city designed to live off its own stores for weeks, maybe even months. And when supplies dwindled, the quietest and most agile members of the community, often boys no older than 12, would be sent up secret shafts to forage, gather water, or bring word. This act of sending a child out, alone, into an uncertain world speaks to the courage built into everyday life down there. It was not a grand drama, not a war film. It was daily risk. Routine vigilance, the small, steady actions of people determined to remain invisible and alive. One cannot help but wonder, how do people feel in this place? There are no surviving letters, no written accounts, no carved names. The people of Daring Q didn't leave their emotions behind in stone, and yet, you can guess, perhaps some felt relief to be safe from raiders or soldiers or brutal taxation. Perhaps others felt claustrophobia, isolation, the weight of the ceiling as a kind of silent judgment. There were surely moments of laughter too. Children are adaptable. They likely invented games that worked within corridors in silence. Families shared meals. Elders told stories. Birthdays were remembered, even if not celebrated. There were likely births down there, and deaths. And perhaps that is the strangest thought of all, that someone's entire life may have passed within those walls. Born underground, raised underground, died underground, without ever leaving a mark, without even a gravestone. For a long time, Daring Q remained a whispered rumor in the villages above. The idea that something vast and hidden lay below the feet of farmers and shepherds. Some dismissed it as legend. Others believed the tunnels housed treasure. Few feared they were cursed. It wasn't until 1963 that a Turkish man attempting to renovate his home in Nevihir province broke through a wall in its basement and discovered a dark tunnel behind it. He followed it, then another, and then another. What he stumbled into was not a simple wine cellar or a secret room. It was the forgotten mouth of Daring Q. Authorities were called. Archaeologists followed, and layer by layer, the ancient city began to reveal itself, room after room, hall after hall. Engineers had to map the ventilation shafts, the chimneys, the flood traps. Historians tried to date the carvings, estimate the population, trace the architecture's evolution over centuries, but answers came slowly. They still do, to this day. Only a portion of Daring Q has been fully excavated. Many tunnels remain collapsed or sealed, some are inaccessible due to the risk of cave-ins, and no one knows exactly how far it stretches or how many people may have once lived and died in its quiet depths. The city raises more questions than it answers. Who first conceived of such a place? What oral traditions kept its architecture alive before writing did? How many generations of people helped expand it, adapt it, use it, without ever claiming it? Why was no name ever left behind? not even a symbol. One theory is that the people saw themselves as custodians, not creators. They inherited Durinkyu like a secret, one that had to be preserved, not owned. Another theory posits that the place itself held spiritual meaning, that to carve your name into its walls would have been seen as arrogance, as if trying to possess what was meant to protect all. And yet another theory, perhaps the most haunting, is that no name was left behind, because no name was meant to survive. That Durinkyu was built on the understanding that survival required silence, not glory. That anonymity was the price of peace. Today, Durinkyu is open to visitors. It's parts of it anyway. You can walk through some of its levels, stooping beneath low ceilings, climbing narrow stairs, squeezing through passageways only wide enough for one person. You can feel the cool breath of the earth pressing in, and you can wonder, as millions have, who built this, and why did they leave it behind? There are no dramatic plaques, no reenactments, no holograms or modern displays. It's carved stone, in silence. It's easy to get lost, even now, if you stray from the guide path. Not lost in space, necessarily, but lost in time. The past is thick down there, not in blood or conflict, but in the dull ache of daily endurance, in the lived experience of people who never asked to be remembered. They just wanted to survive. So we end with this reflection. When we think of ancient cities, we often imagine towering walls and gleaming temples, the stuff of empire and power. But Durinkyu is a reminder that some of the greatest human feats weren't acts of domination, but acts of hiding, of resilience, of patient, visible hope. It's a city that speaks not through monuments, but through its decision not to be seen, through rooms carved for families, not kings, through tunnels designed to shelter, not parade. Durinkyu does not ask to be known, it asks to be understood. And that, perhaps, is why it still haunts us, because it forces us to ask, what kind of world must exist for people to choose life in the dark, with no name, no story, and no promise of memory. If you stood upon the edge of the Arpakai Valley today, where the border of Turkey bleeds softly into the ghost of Armenia, you might see nothing at first. A wide sweep of ochre hills, dry grass curling in the breeze, distant birds wheeling lazily above the creases of the plain. The land feels quiet, too quiet, even for the forgotten outskirts of Anatolia. I take a few steps further, down a slope carved by erosion and wind, and something begins to shift. A line of jagged stones, a half wall barely visible beneath the earth, a solitary arch still standing against a sky that forgot it. And then, slowly, the ghost begins to materialize. A city called Ani, 1,000 years ago. Ani was called the city of 1,001 churches. It stood proudly on the Silk Road, a glittering Armenian capital that thrived with markets, pilgrims, scribes, traders, architects, masons, and monarchs. By the 11th century, it was home to over 100,000 people, a jewel of faith and commerce, perched on the highlands. But now, Ani is a ruin. More than a ruin, it is a city that has vanished so deeply into the land that many people don't even know it existed. Its walls remain crumbling, its towers still reach, but they reach into silence. What happened to Ani is not a simple story. It wasn't destroyed in a single war. It wasn't buried by one volcano or toppled by one earthquake. No, Ani disappeared slowly, like a candle that flickers for hours before finally dying. And when it was gone, it left behind not only its bones, but the strange question that still echoes across those lonely fields. How does a city once known as the Baghdad of the North vanish almost completely, with no trace in most history books and no monument marking its fall? To answer that, we must go back to its beginnings, not at the moment of its glory, but further back, to its silence. The earliest traces of Ani date to the 5th century CE, when it was little more than a fortress on a hill, a strategic plateau overlooking the river. perched like a watchful hawk between two regions constantly at war, Byzantium and Persia. Its position was everything. Whoever controlled Ani could see the movements of caravans, armies, and weather. But the plateau wasn't just useful, it was beautiful. The soil was rich, the wind was fresh, the valley was green in spring and burned gold in summer. Slowly, a village formed, then a church, then a royal house. By the 9th century, Kani came under the control of the Bagratid dynasty, a line of Armenian kings who dreamed not just of military power, but of culture. They saw Ani not as a stronghold, but as a symbol. They poured wealth into it, importing stonemasons, commissioning architects, and laying wide boulevards of salt volcanic tuff. They carved domes that curved like honeycombs, arches that lifted the eye toward heaven, and churches, so many churches that travelers claimed to hear bells at every hour, each tower marking a different quarter of the day. But Ani was not just a city of faith, it was a city of trade. Its markets filled with silks from the east, coins from Byzantium, carpets from the Caucasus. The streets rang with multiple tongues: Armenian, Greek, Syriac, Persian, Arabic. Travelers described it as a rival to Constantinople, and indeed, in some years, Ani's wealth surpassed even imperial expectations. By the 10th century, the city's walls were expanded, not once, not twice, but 3 times to accommodate the growing population. And yet, seeds of its silence were already being planted. You see, Ani had no natural moat, no mountain to shield it. Its prosperity made it tempting. Its position made it vulnerable. For every merchant who passed through the city's gates, a warlord was not far behind. In 1064, disaster came. The Seljuk Turks, led by Alp Arslan, launched an assault. Their siege weapons cracked the walls. Their soldiers poured in. The records say over 16,000 people were killed in just one day. A number so vast it no longer feels human. What was once a peaceful, cosmopolitan city became a cemetery in hours. And yet Ani survived. It was not completely razed. The churches stood, though many were desecrated. The homes were plundered, but the foundations endured. For nearly a century, the city staggered forward, ruled by Turks, then Georgians, then briefly retaken by Armenians. But it was never the same. Each time a new empire laid claim to it, something was stripped away. First, its wealth, then its unity, then its name. By the time the Mongols swept through in the 13th century, Ani was already a shadow of itself. The Mongols didn't destroy it directly, but they broke the trade routes that fed it. And without trade, Ani starved. A city can be defended against swords and fire, but not against slow abandonment. And yet, perhaps the most tragic part of Ani's history was not its sacking, but its forgetting. By the 1600s, European travelers noted only ruins with no city nearby. By the 1800s, entire sections of Ani had collapsed into dust, buried under layers of wind-blown earth. Some churches had lost their roofs. Others were split in half by earthquakes. Cows grazed in what had once been the cathedral. No one lived there. No one visited. The city disappeared, not just from maps, but from memory. Its once great name faded from Armenian texts. Ottoman scholars ignored it. Western academics dismissed it, and even when a few archaeologists began exploring its bones in the 19th century. Their work was slow, limited, and often suppressed by politics. The region became sensitive, a borderland between hostile empires. And so, the ruins were closed off, left to be swallowed by time. Today, Ani is protected. It's a World Heritage Site, a place of silent pilgrimage for Armenians, Turks, and history lovers. But still, it is quiet, remote, and mostly ignored. Its great cathedral has no roof. Its library is dust. Its church is once 1001, now number fewer than 30. And what is most strange of all, there are no grand monuments to Ani's fall, no epic poem mourning its fate, no surviving book chronicling its last days. Even Armenian folktales seldom speak of it. It's as if the city, in dying, asked to be forgotten. Or perhaps it was made to be forgotten. An sits in a land carved by conflict between Armenia and Turkey, between Islam and Christianity, between memory and denial. To remember Ani fully would mean confronting all those things. And so, it is safer to forget. Safer to let the earth reclaim the city, to let the grass grow taller each year, hiding the stones, to let the wind erase its name, syllable by syllable. But the bones are still there. The streets are still carved beneath the soil. The bells no longer ring. But sometimes, at dawn, when the mist rolls low across the plateau, you might imagine you hear something. A chime. Chant. A sound so faint, it could be anything. Chord, nothing. That is the sound of Ani remembering itself. And the question that still lingers, how does a city of 100,000 souls vanish so completely that even memory feels forbidden? Forbidden. The stones of Ani do not speak, but the dust between them holds a language all its own. If you could brush your hand gently across the walls of what was once the Cathedral of Serb, Stefacha, Sid Wajadson, the Holy Mother of God, you might feel not just the ridges and cracks of centuries, but the texture of waiting. Waiting for someone to remember, for someone to ask what happened to the people who once walked those streets, who opened shop at sunrise and closed their shutters to keep out the wind, who carved their names into door frames that are now part of the soil. You see, cities do not simply die. They linger, even as Ani crumbled. There were still lives inside its families who refused to leave, monks who maintained the rites of silence, merchants who clung to hope that the caravans would return. Tej, nor the second. They endured war, earthquakes, empire, and exile. This section is about them, not the kings, not the architects, but the ones who stayed. By the early 13th century, Ani was not the city it had once been. Its days as a flourishing capital under the bag-ridded kings were long gone. Still, thousands remained. They lived among ruins that were not yet ruins. The city was like a great book, slowly losing its pages. Tired quarters were abandoned, but others persisted. The northern neighborhoods still echoed with the clang of blacksmiths. The quarter near the Akurian River still had gardens quiet, terraced pockets of green where women grew herbs and vegetables in soil, softened by centuries of ash. One of the most enduring presences in Ani, during this slow unraveling, was the community of monks who tended the city's many churches. There were far fewer than before, perhaps a few dozen, compared to hundreds in Ani's golden age. But they remained devoted to their quiet rituals. They chanted psalms in cracked chapels. They kept records, though many have since been lost. They taught the children who still lived within the shrinking walls. The monastic complex at the Church of St. Gregory of Tigran, Onits, is one of the few places where some of their legacy survives. Though the outer walls are battered and its roof partially collapsed, its interior still bears frescoes, faded images of saints and kings painted in the 13th century. It's picked a time that was already slipping away, even as it was being recorded. The monks must have known that they were caretakers not only of the faith, but of memory. They copied manuscripts long after Ani's libraries had been looted or destroyed. In those dim sanctuaries, lit only by narrow slits in the stone, they wrote of saints and theology, but also quietly of siege, hunger, and departure. Some fragments of these monastic notes survive in Armenian archives. In them, you find no fiery language, no cries for vengeance. Instead, there is resignation, quiet accounting of what was no longer there. "We have buried 6 this winter," one reads. There are fewer mouths, but more space. May God forgive us. Another, from a decade later. The church bell cracked last month. We no longer ring it at full voice. These were not dramatic records. They were not meant to impress. They were simply accounts of a city slowly folding in on itself, of a people caught in a long decline. Among the civilian population, the tone was much the same. Most of the traders had left, so had the jewelers, the scribes, the foreign craftsmen who had once filled Ani with their skills. What remained were tanners, herders, potters, those whose lives were tied to the land, and who could not leave even if they wished to. There is evidence that some homes were repurposed during this period. Multi-family dwellings became the norm. Large mansions once, the homes of nobles, were divided into smaller rooms, with makeshift walls made of timber and clay. Entire courtyards were turned into gardens. Rooms that had once hosted guests from Byzantium were used to store firewood and salt. Clothing changed too. The fine silks and dyed woolens of earlier centuries gave way to coarser, practical fabrics. Styles grew simpler. Ornamentation became rare. Even language evolved. The Armenian spoken in Ani took on peculiar cadences, mixing with Turkish, Georgian, and Kurdish phrases as the region's control shifted again and again. What is striking is not the rapidity of the decline, but its gradualism. Year after year, a few more people left, few more buildings fell, few more rituals were shortened or skipped, but no single year marked the end. It was a slow fading, like a fresco losing color in the sun, and yet there were still moments of life. In spring, children played in the alleys. At harvest, families gathered to dry fruits on rooftops. In winter, neighbors shared warmth around simple clay stoves, and every Sunday, a few dozen people gathered in what remained of the cathedral to hear a sermon in the echoing nave. They did not call themselves survivors. They simply lived. By the mid-14th century, Ani's population was likely fewer than 5,000, but something more permanent was coming. The Black Death reached the region in the late 1340s. Like everywhere it touched, it swept away entire families. Villages disappeared overnight. Trade routes collapsed completely. Even the small markets of any already pale shadows of their former self shut down. And yet, even after the plague, some people remained. Not many, but enough to light a fire in the cold months, enough to say prayers in cracked Armenian, enough to remind each other that this city had once been the heart of a kingdom. It is believed that by the 15th century, Ani was reduced to a cluster of barely inhabited quarters. The remaining churches were looted or desecrated, their carved stone reused by newcomers who built temporary homes along the walls. One Ottoman traveler, Evliya Çelebi, passed through in the 17th century. He described Ani not as a living city, but as a ghost that rattles with wind. He noted strange carvings, empty churches, and the silence of its streets. Still, he found a few inhabitant Armenian families and Kurdish shepherds living in what he called the bones of the dead. No chronicles of these families survive, but their lives are etched into the stones they stacked, the pottery they left behind, the soot marks on the ceilings of ruined chapels. It's not that the people of Ani were forgotten, it's that they were never written about in the first place. So what do we make of these quiet lives? These nameless families who stayed as their city vanished around them. Perhaps they didn't see themselves as tragic. They were simply following the rhythm of the earth. Cities rise. Cities fall. People stay until they can no longer. They lived in homes their ancestors built. They walked roads that had once known kings. They folded their prayers into walls that no longer stood straight. And eventually, when the last family left, no one knows exactly when there was no ceremony, no marker. It's the final closing of a door, a final extinguishing of a fire. And then the earth began to take Ani back. Wind filled its streets, grass cracked its stones, dust buried its stories. And centuries later, when explorers and historians returned, they did not find a city of heroes or villains. They found silence. But perhaps that silence is its own kind of monument. They say the earth never forgets. That even when cities collapse and people disappear, the ground keeps a memory. It holds the shape of old walls, swallows the bones of empires, and slowly presses history into layers of stone in silence. But human memory isn't like that. It can be edited, erased, bent around borders, and rewritten until even the people who once lived in a place cannot find its name on a map. In the city of 1,000 churches, once capital of a Christian kingdom, was not just swallowed by time. It was buried by politics, by borders, and by a long, careful forgetting. If you stood atop its walls in the 11th century, you would have seen an open plain filled with color and movement, markets bustling with traders, minarets rising near churches, people speaking a patchwork of languages: Armenian, Arabic, Persian, Greek. Today, if you visit, you see none of that. You see stone, bones, an empty sky, and you hear nothing but wind. But why? How could a city once known across Asia and the Middle East disappear so completely that even the nation it once belonged to, Armenia, was denied access to it for generations? This section is about what came after the people left, about what it means to forget a city on purpose. By the late 17th century, Ani had long ceased to function as a city. Its remaining buildings were collapsing. The last families had either been absorbed into nearby villages or left during the Ottoman-Safavid conflicts that engulfed the region. What remained was ruin and memory, but even ruins have meaning. And meaning in a contested land can be dangerous. The region surrounding Ani, once the heart of medieval Armenia, became the object of centuries of imperial struggle. The Ottomans and the Persians fought for it. Later, the Russians advanced from the north. Every time the map changed, Ani became more remote, less relevant, till it was no longer anyone's capital, but merely a ruin on a disputed frontier. And then, the 20th century, the forgetting truly began. The Armenian genocide of 1915 reshaped everything in the spring of that year. The Ottoman Empire began systematically removing its Armenian population, first from the cities, then from the villages, and finally from the very land itself. Over 1 million people were killed or forced into exile. It was not just a campaign of murder, but of erasure. Churches were burned, cemeteries desecrated, records destroyed. And among the casualties was Ananot in the physical sense. But in memory, the Ottoman government understood the power of symbols. An Enian, ancient Armenian city, once bursting with churches, was one of the most potent. So they silenced it. The ruins were left to decay. Access was restricted. Locals were discouraged from visiting. Armenian scholars, those who had long studied the city's architecture and history, were either dead or in exile. Their manuscripts were burned, their libraries scattered, and Ani faded once again, not because of time, but because of deliberate forgetting. In the decades that followed, Ani became a forbidden place. After the fall of the Ottoman Empire, the region became part of the Republic of Turkey. Ani now lay just a few hundred meters from the newly drawn border with Sovietania, Armenia separated by the Akurian River. What had once been the cultural heart of a kingdom was now a militarized zone. The city was surrounded by fencing and guard posts. Turkish soldiers patrolled the site. Armenian visitors were banned entirely. Even Turkish citizens needed special permission to enter. The ancient churches, some of the most important examples of medieval Armenian architecture, stood in silence, visited only by wind and rain. Occasionally, shepherds passed through. Sometimes, military drills were conducted in the area. In the 1950s and 60s, parts of Ani were used for artillery practice. The frescoes were pierced by bullets. Carvings were shattered by tank fire. This was not accidental. It was part of a broader attempt to strip Ani of his identity, to make it just another pile of rocks. But even in silence, the stones resisted. In the 19th century, before Ani was sealed off, a group of archaeologists, mostly European and Armenian, had documented many of its buildings. They sketched its walls, measured its churches, translated the inscriptions. They wrote long reports filled with admiration and sadness, sensing even then that Ani was already vanishing. Their notes and drawings survived in distant libraries in Paris, Keene, and Yerevan. And it was through these records that a new generation of Armenians remembered what Ani had been. They could not visit, but they taught its architecture in universities. They printed its churches in textbooks. They sang its name in folk songs. Ani became a symbol, not of power, but of loss. Capital that no longer had a country. A city that belonged to a people who had no way to return. Change came slowly. In the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, Armenia became an independent country. Diplomatic relations with Turkey remained strained, but small openings began to appear. Turkish archaeologists, some of them descendants of the very empire that tried to erase Ani, began re-examining the site. Quietly, carefully, they cleaned the frescoes, rebuilt crumbling walls, protected what remained. In 2001, UNESCO placed Ani on its tentative list of World Heritage Sites. Tourists began trickling in, not many, but enough to make a difference. Some were Turkish, some were foreign. A few were Armenian diaspora members, returning to see with their own eyes what their grandparents had spoken of. And still, Ani waited. The city is still not easy to visit. It lies in eastern Turkey, near the town of Kars. The roads are long and often empty. Winters are brutal. Summers are dry and dusty. But if you go, and if you walk through the Gate of the Lions, you will feel something unusual. There are no vendors, no tour buses, just stone and sky. The cathedral stands partially collapsed. The Church of the Redeemer is split down the middle. The walls still encircle the site, though many sections have fallen. And yet, there is something alive here. You see it in the way the grass has grown in the courtyards, following the memory of gardens. In the way birds perch where bells once rang. In the way some stones still bear names, faintly carved 1,000 years ago. You see it in the fact that the city still exists at all. It was not meant to survive. Not the sieges, not the earthquakes, not the genocides, or the wars, or the forgetting. And yet, here it is, waiting for someone to ask what happened. Today, Kini is a symbol, once more, but not of power or empire. It is a symbol of what remains, after forgetting how silence can be broken, not with noise, but with care, with footsteps on an old road, with the brushing of fingers against stone, with the decision to remember, even when everything was built to erase. There is no full recovery for Ani. Too much has been lost. But there is something valuable in what remains, in the unfinished frescoes, in the empty archways, in the stories of people who stayed until they couldn't, who buried their prayers in soil that still holds their warmth, and in the knowledge that no city, no matter how erased, is truly Ganaz, long as someone remembers to walk its streets again, even if they are made of wind. If you were walking across the flat plains of central Anatolia, there's very little that would make you stop. The land is brown, dry, and featureless. Low hills roll into the distance like hardened waves. Sheep graze near the edges of small farms. The modern town of Deringu, quiet and unremarkable, sits low and square among the plains of Cappadocia. There are no towers, no ruined walls, nothing that announces history in grand terms. And yet, beneath your feet, a city stretches silently down 8 floors into the ground. 20,000 people deep. You might have stood on top of it and never known. It's not hidden behind locked doors or barbed wire. It was simply forgotten. Not in a dramatic collapse, but in the quiet erosion of memory. For centuries, people in Q lived ordinary lives above what may have been the largest underground city in the ancient world, without realizing the scale of what lay below. It wasn't until 1963, when a man knocked down part of his basement wall, that the past spilled out into the present. And what he found was not just a few old tunnels or STOREROMs. It was an entire city. The story begins long before Q was a name, before even the language spoken in this land was Turkish Cappadocia. Today, part of central Turkey, was once a borderland. For nearly 3,000 years, it sat between empires. The Hittites ruled here in the 2nd millennium BCE. Later came the Phrygians, the Persians, the Romans, the Byzantines. Each left their imprint on the land above, and possibly below. But it's the volcanic soil of Cappadocia that made the underground cities possible. The region's bedrock is soft, volcanic tufa type of rock formed from compacted ash. Tuff is soft enough to be carved easily with hand tools, but hardens over time when exposed to air. This unique combination of properties meant that people here, long ago, discovered something extraordinary. You could dig into the earth-shaped rooms and passageways, and the walls would hold. And so they dug. First for storage, then for shelter, then, slowly, over centuries, for survival. What they left behind was a city, buried not under rubble, but built purposefully and patiently beneath the ground. The true origins of Q are still debated. Some archaeologists suggest that the first chambers were carved by the Phrygians around the 8th or 7th century BCE. Others believe that the Hittites, centuries earlier, may have begun the practice of underground carving. What is certain is that by the early Byzantine era, the cities had become sophisticated complexes, complete with air shafts, wells, kitchens, living quarters, churches, and schools. Q was the deepest of them all. It extended roughly 18 stories down over 280 feet and connected to at least 200 smaller underground settlements through miles of tunnels. But why did anyone need a city so far below? Because in Cappadocia, danger didn't just come from nature. It came from men from armies, raiders, and empires. For much of the early medieval period, the people of this region lived under the threat of invasion. Arab armies crossed the mountains from the south. Mongol raiders swept across the plains. Later came the Seljuks, and then the Ottomans. The people of Cappadocia, often Christian minorities like the Greek-speaking Cappadocians and Armenians, were vulnerable, and so they turned to the ground. The underground cities were not meant to be permanent homes. They were temporary sanctuaries. During times of attack, entire populations could vanish below. But the entrances, sometimes hidden inside wells or barns, were sealed with massive round stones that could be rolled into place from inside. Air shafts brought in ventilation, heat. Wells ensured clean water. Livestock were housed in underground pens. Even schools operated beneath the rock. The people could live for weeks, sometimes months, below the earth, waiting for danger to pass above. Raiders would find empty villages and wind-blown silence. Below, thousands of people listened for footsteps. But, for all their complexity, these underground cities were never written about in much detail. There are few surviving texts. No signs posted in ancient towns. No inscriptions at the entrances. It was a kind of silent architecture passed down through practice rather than paper. The knowledge of the tunnels was kept within families, communities, oral memory. You showed your children the entryway. You told them which tunnel to take. You taught them how to breathe underground. And, slowly, over generations, those memories faded, especially as the threats above diminished. When peace lasted long enough, the doors were closed one last time, and then even those stories were forgotten. By the time the Ottomans ruled this land fully, the underground cities were abandoned. Locals remembered them only vaguely as strange caves or dry wells, as places full of bats and ghosts. In many homes, the entry points were simply covered or walled off. Basements were bricked up. Over decades, then centuries, the knowledge vanished. Durinkyu was no longer a living city, but it was still there, buried under the feet of thousands of people, forgotten by nearly everyone. Until one day in 1963, a man decided to knock down a wall in his house. No one knows the name of the man who rediscovered Durinkyu. His story is repeated in tourist guides and archaeological journals alike, always in vague terms. He was remodeling. He knocked through stone, expecting more space, and found a narrow room carved into the rock. He explored further and found another, then another. Then a tunnel. He called the authorities, and that, quietly and without ceremony, was the beginning of Derinkyu's rebirth. The Turkish government sent archaeologists. They crawled into the darkness. They brought lights and tools and maps. What they found stunned them. Not just a few caves, but an entire ancient world beneath the modern one. Vaulted rooms, carved staircases, kitchens with soot still staining the ceilings, chapels carved with Byzantine crosses, defensive doors, secret passages, schools with benches and blackened walls, a city beneath a town. Over the next few decades, ecologists carefully excavated the upper levels of Durinkyu. They reinforced ceilings, installed lighting, mapped the chambers. Not all of it has been opened to the public. Only about 10% is accessible today. But even that small portion offers a glimpse into the vastness of what once existed below. There are kitchens with stone counters, living spaces with carved niches for oil lamps, massive vertical shafts that carried air from the surface down to the lowest levels. There are wells some 200 feet deep. There's even a small underground winery, its pressing stones still in place. Every detail was practical, efficient, designed for survival, and all of it was built by hand, by people with no machines, only chisels, patience, and the quiet knowledge that someday they might need to disappear again. But there's still much we don't know. Who exactly built the deepest layers of Durinkyu? Were they carved all at once or over centuries? How many people lived here during each wave of occupation? How many other underground cities are yet to be discovered in the soft rock of Cappadocia? Some believe that Durinkyu and nearby Kamakok were connected by miles of underground tunnel. Others argue that many of the region's modern towns may still have hidden entrances beneath old homes and courtyards, and even though it's now a UNESCO-protected site, Durinkyu continues to keep its secrets. It is a city built for silence, and silence still surrounds it. So if you ever visit the region and you walk the quiet streets of Durinkyu, look carefully. The modern homes and tea shops are ordinary enough. The people are friendly. Children play soccer on dusty lots. But somewhere beneath you, far beneath your shoes, there are stairs carved into rock, walls blackened by centuries of fire, and rooms filled with the echo of forgotten prayers. The earth does not forget. It simply waits to understand how Durinkyu operated, not just as a marvel of engineering, but as a functioning, living city. You have to picture what daily life underground might have actually felt like. It wasn't a permanent residence, not in the way you imagine homes with flower pots and courtyards and dogs barking in alleyways. It was a survival mechanism, a last resort, a collective decision to vanish into the rock until danger passed. Yet even that required extraordinary coordination, planning, and adaptation, because once the heavy stone doors rolled into place, once the air outside grew still, life below the ground had to continue for weeks, sometimes longer, And so, people made rules for how to live underground. Let's walk through it. To begin with, entry was never haphazard. The underground cities of Cappadocia, especially Derinku, were built with intention. The entrances were narrow and defensible, often leading through steep tunnels no wider than a single person's shoulders. In some cases, entry points were disguised inside homes, beneath livestock pens, or at the bottom of wells. Some tunnels curved intentionally to slow intruders, preventing a direct line of attack. Others were carved with low ceilings to force any attacker to crouch, while defenders behind corners could strike from better angles. The stone doors, massive, circular, boulders carved from volcanic rock, were rolled into place across the inside of tunnel openings. From the outside, they looked like part of the wall. From the inside, they were immovable barriers. Each one weighed hundreds of kilograms and could only be shifted with wooden levers from the safe side. Inside, the city descended layer by layer, and each level had a purpose. The uppermost floors were the most practical. Here, you'd find stables for animals, mostly sheep, goats, and chickens. Bringing livestock underground served a dual purpose: food and concealment. An enemy finding an empty village but hearing livestock might suspect hiding. Better to bring the noise below and leave the surface eerily silent. These stables were built with sloped floors for drainage, ear holes for ventilation, and sometimes feeding troughs carved into the walls. The smell must have been pungent. Likely, the first few levels bore the brunt of that daily grime and noise. Descending deeper, you'd find kitchens and food storage rooms. There were stone shelves and carved niches for amphorae of oil, sacks of dried grains, and preserved fruits. Some rooms even had small ovens vented through narrow shafts to the surface, their smoke disguised by surrounding terrain or dissipated through multiple exit points. Ash still lines the ceilings of these kitchens today. Near these utility areas were the wells, critical to any long stay underground. Derinku had several independent water sources that ran from aquifers, not surface rivers. That distinction is crucial. Surface water could be poisoned by an attacker, but an aquifer-fed well dug deep into the earth remained safe. Some of the wells descended over 50 meters and were sealed off from lower floors, suggesting they served specific levels independently to maintain water quality and prevent overuse. As you moved farther down, the city became more human, living. Quarters were small, dark chambers carved into the rock with rounded ceilings and smooth walls. Most rooms were no bigger than 2 or 3 meters across, with little ornamentation. In place of beds, people likely used straw mats or woven blankets rolled out on the floor. Each family might have had a space the size of a large closet. Its privacy was rare, and the darkness was constant. Oil lamps lit every corner. There were niches carved into the walls to hold them small, rounded depressions, blackened from flame. The lamps burned animal fat or olive oil, producing light and soot in equal measure. You can imagine the air down there. It's not quite smoky, but never fresh. Stale with time, slightly moist. Filled with the distant sounds of livestock above children, playing in deeper chambers, the slow drip of water, and the occasional murmur of a prayer. But life underground wasn't only about hiding. Hey, it had to include structure. On one of Derinku's lower levels sits a surprising chamber-wide, vaulted, and distinctly ecclesiastical, a church carved entirely from rock, with an apse, nave, and altars. The Byzantine cross is still etched into its ceiling. This was not a temporary feature. It was a declaration of faith carved into stone. People who fled below still needed to believe. They still needed ceremony, even if the world above was chaos. Nearby were communal rooms, possibly used as schools, where children were taught by candlelight. Some chambers have benches carved directly into the walls, facing small, raised platforms. Others were thought to be gathering halls, perhaps for councils or family meetings. Religion, education, and governance are accounted for beneath the soil. Ventilation was the lifeblood of the city. Without fresh air, people would suffocate. Daringku's architects knew this, and they built accordingly. Dozens of vertical shafts ran from the lowest levels to the surface, providing airflow to every chamber. These shafts were narrow and often disguised as wells or natural crevices. Some shafts were as deep as 55 meters. Their placement wasn't random. Engineers likely understood prevailing winds and topography well enough to ensure cross-ventilation, coiling in cool air and pushing out warm, stale currents. In many ways, Darinkyu functioned as a living lung, breathing in survival and exhaling fear. But with safety came risk. Disease was a constant threat in confined spaces. Poor sanitation, contaminated water, and close proximity made even minor illnesses dangerous. There were latrines, usually carved pits, but nothing like modern sewage. Dust was either buried or removed via tunnels, but the possibility of infection would have lingered. Food, too, was finite. The people stored preserved grains, legumes, and meats, but the longer they remained underground, the more precarious their situation became. Rationing was likely strict. Elders and children may have eaten differently. There may have been rotating meal times to conserve space and heat. And though Darinkyu was vast, still required silence. The very thing that made the city secure its secrecy also made it isolating. People couldn't shout, they couldn't run. They had to live quietly, move carefully, and avoid detection at all costs. The walls did not echo with laughter. They absorbed it. There is no record of how long people stayed underground at any one time. A few weeks is likely. A month, perhaps, during times of serious conflict. The psychological toll must have been enormous. Imagine the constant semi-darkness, the same routine, the pressure of limited supplies, the muffled sound of enemy boots above, or the long silence of not knowing where the danger had passed. Families huddled together, with no way to look outside. Children grew restless. Adults whispered. The lamps were always burning, but the shadows never disappeared. And yet, no one fled, because above them waited far worse things: raiders, persecution, and slaughter. Down here, beneath the mountain, beneath the fields, there was control. Cramped, smelly, exhausting, but controllable. The silence was a shield. When danger finally passed, whether days or weeks later, the people emerged. Slowly, cautiously, blinking in the sunlight. They would rebuild, replant, repair, but each time they returned below, the memory deepened. The chambers expanded. New tunnels were dug. More levels were added. The system became generational, each layer a scar, but also a strategy. The city evolved. It became the habit of a people who had learned how to vanish. And then, after centuries, the danger receded. Armies no longer marched through the valleys with the same ferocity. Its empire stabilized. The people of Cappadocia gradually stopped using the underground cities, not with ceremony, but with disuse. They closed the doors. The tunnels grew dusty. The wells dried. The lamps went cold. No one needed to remember how to disappear anymore, until they did. Darinkyu is now one of the few places on Earth where you can stand inside the strategy of a vanished world. You can walk the same tunnels. You can see the soot stains from ancient fires. You could feel the press of history without a word spoken. And yet, there's still so much we don't know. How were decisions made down there? Who decided when it was time to go below, when it was safe to rise? Did the builders imagine their city would one day be forgotten? Or were they only thinking of the next generation, not the next millennium? Why were some rooms sealed and never reopened? What else is still buried beneath the earth? waiting to be rediscovered. Perhaps the quiet walls of Daring Q hold the answers, but they're not giving them up easily. By the time the underground city of Daring fell into full abandonment, the world above had already shifted. The Seljuks were no longer the primary threat. The Mongol incursions faded. The Byzantines had long collapsed into historical memory. And the Ottoman world, though vast and complex, brought a strange kind of surface calm to the region. The people of Cappadocia didn't descend into the earth as often anymore. They still remembered the tunnels, of course. Some used the upper chambers to store food or protect livestock from bitter Anatolian winters, but the rhythm of full retreat into the underground began to fade. Over time, no one remembered what all the rooms were for. Fewer people knew how the ventilation shafts worked. Children stopped learning which stone wall rolled shut and which one did not. And so the dust began to collect. Not suddenly, not with any great drama. The earth reclaims quietly, pebble by pebble, room by room. It begins with disuse. A tunnel becomes unstable. A room's ceiling drips just enough moisture to turn to mud. A wooden lever rots and breaks off from a stone door. Then a tunnel collapses. A ventilation shaft clogs with falling debris. The stables filled with sediment brought in by rodents, then insects, then roots. Soon, a generation grows up who no longer walks into the earth like their grandparents once did. Then comes forgetting. It's not easy to imagine a society slowly forgetting a structure as immense as Daring, but forgetting doesn't always mean ignorance. Sometimes it means irrelevance. You may know the place exists, but if it's no longer vital to your survival, it becomes a background detail. Like a story you heard once, but didn't need to remember. A name that only the elders still spoke. And so the tunnels sat silent, while the world continued its procession of empires, languages, and borders. Above ground, new villages rose. Farmers tilled fields that once fed the hidden cities. Churches and mosques were built over forgotten shafts. Some wells remained, but no one questioned why they echoed more than they should. And underground, Daring fell asleep until 1963. In a small home in the Nevşehir province of central Turkey, man was doing renovations. It was the kind of work that felt unremarkable, chipping away a basement wall to expand a room, create a little more space for storage, maybe improve ventilation. But when the wall broke through, he didn't find dirt or stone. He found air, and more than that, he found a passage. What followed is the kind of moment that happens rarely in the modern world. The discovery not of a ruin or a temple fragment, or a mosaic but of a living structure, a full city beneath the ground, still breathing its silent story into the stone. Local authorities were called in. Then the Department of Antiquities. What began as a simple renovation became a national and soon international archaeological revelation. Daring had returned. Exploring the rediscovered city took decades. Some tunnels had collapsed. Others were still intact. Carved rooms gave up their secrets gradually. The grooves where oil jars once sat. The blackened ceilings above long cold ovens. The rollstone doors still sitting in their tracks, unchanged since the day they were last closed. Archaeologists documented 18 levels in total, although only about 8 are open to the public today. They found over 600 entrances, most hidden in plain sight, tundra, homes, fields, and courtyards. Some lead straight into the deeper levels, others twisted and narrowed, requiring crawling on hands and knees. They traced ventilation shafts and water wells, mapped communal kitchens and churches, theorized about wineries, grain mills, and even prisons. They marveled at the scale of planning. No evidence suggested a central blueprint. It was as though generations of people had simply known how to keep building down. But perhaps The most telling discovery was they didn't find. They didn't find treasure. No gold, no ornaments, no statues of grandeur, no monumental inscriptions celebrating the city's founders, because Q wasn't built for glory. It was built for retreat. It was a city not meant to impress, but to hide. So, who exactly built Q? The answer is still debated. Some scholars trace its earliest tunnels back to the Phrygians, an Indo-European people who inhabited the region as early as the 8th century BCE. Others suggest it began even earlier, perhaps in the Hittite era, nearly 4,000 years ago. These early tunnels, crude and narrow, may have provided the foundation for later expansion. The larger, more intricate chambers were likely constructed during the Byzantine period, between the 5th and 10th centuries CE. This was a time when Christian communities often faced persecution, raids, and instability. Carving sanctuaries beneath the surface was a practical solution in a volatile land. But Q's most extensive development may have occurred during the Arab-Byzantine Wars and later the Seljuk invasions. These were times when a single mistake tanked too long on the surface could cost your entire community its life. Each generation that added to Q wasn't building for wealth or celebration. They were building for survival, and survival rarely leaves behind grand monuments. It leaves behind tools, doorways, niches for bread, lamps, air, shafts, the unglamorous architecture of staying alive. In recent decades, Q has seen more visitors than it ever did when it was active. Tourists descend its steep stairways. School groups wander through its narrow halls. Guides point out the apse of the subterranean church or the massive ventilation shaft that could fit a grown man standing upright. But for all the lights and signs and human noise, there remains something quiet beneath the surface. It's in the way. The stone seems to absorb your footsteps. It's in the carved crosses that still linger on the walls. It's in the absence of names. No founder is recorded. No leader is memorialized. No family took credit for building it. Q, unlike the pyramids of Giza or the palaces of Versailles, has no ego, only silence. And that silence is its legacy. So, what can we learn from a city that buried itself beneath a mountain, then waited 1,000 years to be found? We learn that sometimes the most remarkable human achievements are the ones not built to be remembered, but to be forgotten. We learn that survival has its own architecture, quiet, efficient, and invisible. We learn that beneath the noise of history, there are entire civilizations who learned how to vanish, not because they were weak, but because they knew it was the only way to persist. They did not ask to be seen, they asked to be spared, and in their choice to descend into darkness, they left behind a message that the earth has recently chosen to reveal. That message isn't written in stone, it is the stone. So the next time you walk a quiet path in a forgotten corner of the world, and the ground beneath your feet feels strangely hollow, it may be because history is still there, waiting, listening, and maybe even remembering the names no one ever carved. Imagine standing at the edge of a high plateau in eastern Anatolia. The wind is sharp, dry, and filled with dust that has blown across this lonely frontier for centuries. You look out and see grasslands that seem to roll on forever, until they suddenly stop, broken by the jagged remnants of walls, towers, and arches. This was once a place of unimaginable grandeur, a city so glorious that people called it the City of 1001 Churches. This is an and now it is silent, buried, not under stone, not under earth, but under time. Forgotten not by a single disaster, but by the slow erosion of politics, trade routes, earthquakes, and indifference. Q vanished by hiding. Ani vanished in plain sight, lowly turning to dust on the surface. While no one looked back, let's trace the steps Ani sits near the modern-day border of Turkey and Armenia, a place where cultures once collided and flourished. At its height in the 10th and 11th centuries, Ani was a thriving metropolis, home to as many as 100,000 people. It rivaled Constantinople and Baghdad in wealth and beauty. Armenian kings, particularly of the Bagratid dynasty, ruled from here. They chose Ani not only for its beauty and defensible cliffs, but for its potential trade routes, its river access, and its cultural symbolism. The site itself is older than the city. There had been fortifications here since ancient times, and by the time the Bagratid kings began developing it in earnest, Ani had already been passed through the hands of the Byzantines, Persians, Arabs, and others. But it was the Armenians who truly made it theirs. They built churches, dozens upon dozens of them, cathedrals, chapels, and monasteries. From every part of the city, the sound of bells and liturgical chants once echoed through the stone. Each church had its own unique dome, its own set of inscriptions, its own mosaic floors and frescoes. Many of them were architectural masterpieces, like the Cathedral of Ani, built by the architect Tredat, who would later help rebuild the Dome of Hagia Sophia after an earthquake. But beyond religion, Ani was practical. Its outer walls were reinforced and expanded over centuries, with massive towers and multiple layers of gates. The city was strategically situated on trade routes that connected the Caucasus to the Middle East and the Silk Road. Merchants flowed in and out. Silks, spices, manuscripts, and metals were traded in bustling bazaars. And yet, something always lingered beneath the surface. Ani's power was fragile. It sat at the crossroads of empires, and empires, as we know, don't always respect walls. The decline of Ani didn't happen all at once. It wasn't buried under a single catastrophic event. Instead, it unraveled. In 1045, the Byzantines absorbed the city, ending Armenian independence and bringing Ani under the control of Constantinople. But only 2 decades later, in 1064, the Seljuk Turks captured the city, looting many of its treasures. A quote from a Seljuk historian claimed that after the conquest, blood ran like a river, and the city was filled with corpses. Whether exaggerated or not, the trauma left a scar. But Ani was resilient. It endured, changed hands again. The Shaddadids, a Kurdish Muslim dynasty, ruled for a time. Then came the Georgians, then the Mongols. Each ruler left their mark, but also stripped the city a little more whether through conquest or taxation or disinterest. The once glorious churches were repurposed, sometimes defaced. Some were used as stables, others left open to the elements. The Christian Armenian population gradually dwindled. Trade routes shifted. Earthquakes in the 1300s damaged major structures. And without funds for rebuilding or political will to maintain the infrastructure, Ani began to shrink. The city that had once rivaled Constantinople turned into a border outpost, and then into a ruin. By the 1700s, Ani was no longer a city. It was a memory. Travelers and pilgrims occasionally visited the site. They described it in mournful terms: a city of ghosts, a skeleton of stone, the bones of Armenia. European archaeologists and Orientalists took interest in the 19th century, making drawings, taking rubbings of inscriptions, and documenting what remained. The site was largely forgotten outside the region, obscured by conflict between empires Bashid, Ottoman, and Persian. When the Ottoman Empire gained control again, Ani was treated more as a military zone than a cultural heritage site. And after the Armenian genocide of 1915, few Armenians remained to preserve the memory of their once great capital. The land was politically sensitive. Excavations were halted. Inscriptions were left to weather. Churches collapsed. Walls fell down. By the time modern archaeologists returned to Ani in the late 20th century, Large sections of the city had turned to rubble. No one had buried Ani deliberately. Time had done it for them. And yet, fragments endure. Let's walk again through the ruins, but slower this time. You'll see the Church of the Redeemer, what's left of it. It once had a full dome. It's now only half remains, sheared off cleanly, as though the wind had cut it in two. Inside, you'll find faded frescoes and crumbling walls that still hum with silence. The sky peers in like a ghost. Nearby stands the Cathedral of Ani, still imposing despite its wear. The arches soar. You can see where columns once held carved capitals. Birds roost in niches once filled with liturgical chants. The floor is now earth, the roof mostly gone. You'll find cave chapels dug into the cliffs, bridges that lead to nowhere, graves with no names, an entire city waiting not to be rebuilt, but simply to be remembered. What makes Ani so unique is that it wasn't swallowed by nature alone. It was surrounded by human silence, avoided, left politically inconvenient. The people who might have protected either Armenians were systematically erased. And those who remained either couldn't or wouldn't preserve it. So Ani became a lesson, not in catastrophe, but in erosion. Erosion of culture, of memory, of presence. Why is that significant? Because cities are often remembered for how they fall. Pompeii, Carthage, Babylon. We like drama, lava, fire, collapse. But Ani shows us another kind of ending, a fading, a slow, deliberate overlooking. It reminds us that sometimes history isn't buried with a bang but with a sigh. And sometimes what survives isn't the glory, but the dust. That's what makes Ani important, because it asks us, what are we forgetting now? What parts of our world are our languages, our traditions, our spaces are fading, not because of destruction, but because of silence? What happens when no one remembers how to care for a place? Who will write down the last name, carve the last stone, light the last candle? Or will they simply walk away? And when they do, how long before the wind blows through empty streets and all that remains is the question, was there once something here, something here? Close your eyes and picture it, not the Ani of ruins and wind-blown silence, but the Ani of its prime. Before the domes crumbled, before the soil crept up around the foundations, before the world forgot. The year is sometime in the early 11th century. Perhaps around 1010 AD, the morning sun spills over the Acurian River, casting gold across the stone walls of Ani. Still damp with dew, the city stirs early. There are prayers to be said, bread to be baked, and goods to be loaded onto donkeys, bound for trade. This city was not designed to impress foreigners or dazzle passing kings. It was a city built for function and faith built to endure. Its streets were cobbled but narrow, winding among homes made from dark, volcanic, tough stone, the kind that glows orange at dusk. Atop the hills and in the folds of valleys stood churches, many plain on the outside, but resonant with chants and candlelight within. Ani's people weren't emperors or generals, stonecutters, scribes, midwives, soldiers, monks, Armenian by language, Christian by faith, and pragmatic by culture. Their lives weren't dramatic. They were steady, rooted, ordinary, and that's what makes them important. Let's walk through a day. In the early hours, for the market gates fully opened, bakers were already at work. The smell of lavashtin, soft Armenian bread filled the air. The dough, made from barley or emmer wheat, was flattened on round stones and pressed against the hot walls of clay ovens sunken into the ground. In many houses, the same oven served for warmth and cooking. Children fetched water from nearby springs or from public fountains supplied by a system of clay pipes and aqueducts. Water was precious, but not rare. The city had developed Practical. System cisterns dug under courtyards, runoff collected during rare rains. These were designed not for glory, but for survival. A merchant in Ani might spend his day haggling over silks from the east, beeswax from the forests of the Caucasus, or glass from distant Syria. While the Silk Road passed further south, Ani had positioned itself as a regional hub. Armenian traders were famed for their reliability, for their ability to speak multiple languages, and for their respect for written contracts. In a city like Ani, deals weren't sealed with handshakes, but with ink and seals. The scribes were everywhere recording births, drawing up trade agreements, copying gospels, keeping tax registers. They used reed pens and homemade ink. Parchment was precious. Stakes weren't erased, but scraped gently away with a knife. Education, while limited, was valued. Boys, especially sons of wealthier families, were sent to study with the clergy. Reading scripture in Armenian was both a religious and cultural act. Girls, too, were occasionally educated, especially if they came from noble families or entered convents. In these convents, some women spent their lives copying manuscripts, tending gardens, preparing medicines from herbs like thyme and artemisia. They rarely made headlines. Their names are not in any surviving chronicle, and yet their hands preserved texts that would otherwise be lost. As noon approached, the city grew noisier. Markets filled. Stoneworkers pounded chisels into new blocks. Smiths reheated iron tools. Musicians played cithars and flutes. Above it all, the muezzin's call rang out from the Muslim quarter sign of Ani's mixed population, even at its Christian height. Despite being an Armenian Christian capital, Ani was not homogeneous. It had Arab traders, Kurdish shepherds, and small pockets of Syriac Christians. There were even Jewish merchants known to pass through. The city functioned more like a mosaic than a monolith. You could find Greek wine, Persian rugs, Central Asian dyes. Caravans brought salt from the interior and sulfur from volcanic regions. And yet, despite the variety, there was a peculiar stillness to Ani. People moved deliberately. This city was orderly. That may be because the walls reminded them of danger, even during its golden years. Ani existed in a state of subtle vigilance. The frontier was never far. Nomadic raids were always a possibility. The stone fortifications, some over 20 feet thick, were more than architecture. They were memory in stone and acknowledgement that prosperity was temporary. Guards rotated shifts at the main gates, where travelers and traders were checked. Torches lined the inner towers at night, and watchmen would strike iron to sound alarms. Yet, most days passed. UNENTFELLY.AN. I was not a city of drama. It was a city of habit, and those habits mattered. By evening, the pace slowed, smoke curled up from chimneys as families gathered around shared dishes, lentils, onions, flatbread, yogurt if the sheep had given enough milk. Meat was rare for the poor, common for the wealthy goat, lamb, or cured beef. Conversations happened in low voices. There was little boasting. Humility was a cultural ideal, grounded in religious practice. One did not flaunt wealth. One gave to the church or to the poor as quietly as possible. As darkness fell, the churches filled again, not with all-night vigils, but with quiet vespers. Incense curled through carved colonnades. Hymns in classical Armenian drifted like smoke across the vaulted ceilings. Even those who weren't devout knew the value of attending, of being seen by neighbors, of keeping their place in the communal rhythm. And thence Ani, at night, was quiet. Even the soldiers on patrol tried not to disturb. The calm. Only the wind moved freely through the city. The same wind that, centuries later, would strip away its roofs, scatter its stones, and erase the names of those who once stood beneath its domes. Let's pause here. Why does a city like this disappear? It wasn't poor. it wasn't abandoned in panic. Its people were literate, religious, capable. They had food, water, trade. But Ani teaches us something that history often forgets. Cities do not vanish only from disaster. They vanish from disconnection. As trade routes moved, as political centers shifted, as the armies of new empires redrew borders on parchment maps, Ani fell to the edges of attention. It still stood, but it stood alone. And that is perhaps the slowest kind of death a city can endure. Its people moved away. Its officials were transferred. Its churches remained open, but half-filled. Scribes still wrote, but fewer people read. Over time, the tools rusted. The roofs leaked. The walls cracked, and eventually, no one bothered to fix them. It became easier to start somewhere new than to revive the old. Centuries later, travelers would stumble upon Ani's ruins and marvel at their beauty. They'd sketch its arches, photograph its cracked cathedrals. They'd wonder why no one had preserved it, why such beauty had been left to dissolve into the earth. But no one thought to ask about the people who lived there during the final days, the families who watched their neighbors move away, the priests who gave mass to dwindling congregations, the scribes who copied texts that no one requested. Imagine being the last midwife in a city with no births, or the last baker who still heated the oven, even though no one queued for bread. This was Ani's true burial, not under a mountain of dirt, but under a mountain of forgetting. As the stars wheel overhead and the cold settles in, the once bright courtyards fall into shadow. Somewhere, an owl calls. A breeze moves dust through the shattered windows of the Church of St. Gregory. A coin lies in the grass, its inscription worn smooth and still. Ani waits, not for rescue, not for rebuilding, but for remembering. The city was not buried in the way Pompeii was. There was no sudden fire, no frozen moment captured under ash. Ani vanished under a slower kind of ruin, the kind that happens not from violence, but from wind and silence. For centuries, the world forgot it, and then someone remembered. But rediscovery is never a return. It is a conversation with ghosts. Let's go back to the 19th century, when whispers of Ani's bones began reaching the ears of European scholars and Russian generals. At the time, the region of Kars where Ani was located was no longer Armenian. It had passed from empire to empire, from the Seljuks to the Mongols to the Ottomans, and finally to the Russian Empire after the Russo-Turkish War of 1877-2. The Armenians of that time, especially those living under Russian or Ottoman rule, Ani was more than just a memory. It was a symbol of what was lost. A broken cathedral in the steppe, a promise never fulfilled. And so, when the Russians took control of the Kars region, they invited archaeologists, scholars, and photographers to document what was left. The most famous among them was Nicholas Marr, a Georgian Armenian linguist, an archaeologist who began excavating Ani in the early 1900s. He didn't rush, listened. Marr arrived with notebooks, drawing tools, and a sense of awe. The ruins of Ani weren't majestic in a dramatic way. They weren't towering like Roman colosseums or rich like Venetian basilicas, but they were precise, quiet, and strange. Tired churches stood half-sunken in the grass. Arched windows still held their shape. The carved stone crosses, flowers. Ancient script remained, despite centuries of wind. One of Marr's first tasks was mapping, but even that was difficult. The city was vast, and much of it had sunk beneath layers of dust and overgrowth. He had to work slowly, brushing away centuries of silence. Marr's team uncovered the Church of the Redeemer, which, even in its half-collapsed state, showed a sophistication in design that stunned observers. Built around the year 1035, its 12-sided dome had once glowed with copper and sunlight. Now, it stood open to the sky. He documented the cathedral, designed by Tridat, the architect, the same man who helped repair the dome of Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. Kola, that single fact, bridged Ani to the rest of the medieval world in an unexpected way. It reminded everyone that this wasn't some provincial backwater. It was once a center of architectural learning and creativity. Mar sketched every visible inscription, photographing the most fragile ones. Many of them were in classical Armenian, their language frozen in stone, calling out like soft voices from a sealed room. But it was not just grandeur that Mar tried to preserve. He cataloged bits of clay pottery, the remnants of water channels, a door hinge still attached to its frame. He found evidence of ordinary life, dye vats in the homes of clothmakers, burnt pits used for cooking, remnants of small wooden furniture, and in one collapsed building, they found fragments of a handwritten gospel, its ink faded, its parchment torn, but still bearing the delicate curls of Armenian script. The city had not been erased. It had been neglected, and it had waited. But rediscovery didn't mean celebration. As Mar's work continued, Ani found itself caught in a different kind of storm. World War I broke out in 1914. The Ottoman Empire entered the conflict. The Russian Empire began using Ani's territory as a military route. Suddenly, this forgotten place became a front line. The Russian army moved in. Then the Ottomans pushed them out. Then the Armenians took control for a time, and during this period, something irreversible happened. In 1917, Mar's excavations stopped. The Russian Revolution cut funding and communication. Armenian caretakers were left to guard the ruins as war broke out all around them. Then came the Armenian Genocide. The events of 1915-1917 saw the mass deportation and killing of Armenians throughout the Ottoman Empire. While Ani lay on the border, it was still affected. Nearby villages were emptied. The fragile historical memory that had once been passed down orally through songs, prayers, stories was shattered. Some say that caretakers buried documents and artifacts in this earth to protect them. Others say looters came, searching for coins, for gold, for relics. Either way, when peace finally came, Ani had been wounded again, not by nature, but by people. It wasn't until the 1920s that efforts resumed. But by then, borders had changed again. I was no longer under Russian control. It now belonged to the Republic of Turkey, created after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the Turkish War of Independence. And with that came a new silence. Turkey, wary of ethnic tensions and national memory, largely restricted access to Ani. It sat on the frontier, just across the river from Soviet Armenia, and became a military zone. Visitors needed permits. Photography was discouraged. Some churches were destroyed in border skirmishes. Others collapsed due to neglect. No one rebuilt, no one restored, and the city, once again, was left to the wind. What does it mean for a place to be remembered, but unreachable? For decades, Ani became a kind of mythical ghost city used in poetry, invoked in speeches, but rarely visited. Armenians living abroad spoke of it with reverence. Those nearby watched from hillsides, pointing out its towers through binoculars. It wasn't until the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, that things began to change. Borders softened. Armenia became independent. Tourists trickled in. Some preservation began, but by then, Ani was a skeleton. The churches were cracked open. The city walls were crumbling. The intricate carvings on doorways had faded. Today, you can walk through Ani. There are footpaths and signage. Restoration efforts, led by international organizations, are ongoing. But it's not a bustling tourist destination. It's quiet. You walk alone, across dry grass. You hear the wind push through open windows that once held glass. And everywhere, there is the feeling that you're not supposed to be. They're not because of danger, but because of grief. This city was not lost to time. It was lost to indifference. Not one catastrophe buried it, but dozens of small ones did. A war here, a famine there, a missed letter, a cut budget, a forgotten story, a misfiled document. The tragedy of Ani is not that it collapsed, it's that no one tried to hold it up. So, we return to our original question. Why was Ani buried? And perhaps now we can answer more clearly. It wasn't buried by nature. It was buried by politics, by the collapse of community, by the decay of memory. Its burial was emotional before it was physical. 1,000 voices silenced, not by swords, but by silence. The most haunting ruins aren't the ones destroyed in fire. They're the ones that nobody rebuilt. And the most haunting lesson of Ani is this: even beauty can vanish if no one remembers why it mattered. It wasn't built to last forever, and yet, for a brief stretch of time, it flourished. On a broad plain swept by Anatolian winds stood the ancient city of Sardis. It was not hidden by a mountain in the usual sense. No volcanic fury froze its last breath. No landslide swept through with dramatic flourish. And yet, in the centuries that followed its decline, Sardis was covered layer by time, soil, and silence. A different kind of mountain, one made not of stone, but of memory. To understand Sardis is to peel back layers of empire, of language, of ashes and ink. And as you settle in tonight, as your eyes grow heavy and your thoughts begin to drift, we'll let this forgotten city unfold like a scroll unrolling in slow, quiet spirals. Sardis lay in what is now western Turkey, in the ancient region of Lydia. It was once the capital of that proud and wealthy kingdom. Nestled near the foot of Mount Tamalos, with a golden flowing Pactolus River at its feet, a river, as the story goes, that glittered with actual gold. That story begins with the king Croesus. You may have heard the phrase, rich as Croesus. It's a saying that survived the ruin of empires. But long before it was a metaphor, it was a man. Croesus ruled Lydia from Sardis in the 6th century BCE. His wealth was legendary. It's not only because of how much he had, but because of how much he gave away to oracles, to temples, to Greek sanctuaries. His kingdom was the first to mint coins of pure gold and silver in consistent weights, setting a standard that would influence currency across the ancient world. Imagine that entire economy carved in metal, clinking in the pockets of merchants and soldiers, traveling to far ports and returning again. Sardis was not just a place. It was a pulse in the trade routes, a name etched into the wax seals of transactions. But wealth, as history so often proves, does not last. Croesus believed he was untouchable. He consulted the Oracle of Delphi before engaging in war against Cyrus, the Great of Persia. The oracle gave one of its famously cryptic answers: if you cross the river, a great empire will fall. Croesus took this as a green light. He crossed the Halys River, and his own empire fell. The Persians sacked Sardis in 547 BCE, but even that wasn't the city's end. Not yet. The Persians made it a satrapian administrative center. The Greeks later reclaimed it during the conquests of Alexander the Great. The Romans absorbed it into their provincial networks. And for a while, even as regimes changed, Sardis continued to breathe. It had baths and temples, a grand gymnasium, roads paved in marble, synagogue with beautiful mosaic floors, and, somewhere in that city, under tile and ash, there was a library, not one like the famed Library of Alexandria, with scrolls stacked to the ceiling and scribes copying texts by candlelight. No, this was a quieter place, perhaps part of a temple complex or a private villa owned by a scholar priest. There are no surviving catalogs, no grand inscriptions announcing its contents. And yet, archaeologists unearthed the remnants, burned scroll fragments, blackened reeds that were once styluses, ink jars fused with heat. They found them beneath the ruins of a later Byzantine building, dot covered, pressed down, hidden not by decision, but by accident. But before the fire, there was paper, or rather, parchment and papyrus rolled tightly, stored in niches carved into the wall. They may have held religious texts, tax records, poems copied from Greek bards, treatises on ethics or astronomy. No one knows for sure, because the fire came first, and the memory came later. We know about the fire because it left a scar in the 7th century CE. Sardis was struck by an earthquake, one of many in a long chain of tremors that plagued Asia Minor. The city had already been in decline by then, its aqueducts failing, its population shrinking. But the earthquake was followed by fire, and that fire raged through the decaying structures, hollowing them out, turning scrolls into smoke and history into silence. No written account survives of that moment, only the blackened layer in the soil. Archaeologists call it the destruction layer. It rests beneath Byzantine additions and above Roman mosaics. It's where time paused briefly and then resumed in a new key. It was in this ashen boundary that they found the pieces of Sardis's unknown library, and that discovery came not in the grandeur of a spotlight, but in the dull hum of excavation. The excavation began in the late 1950s, led by a team from Harvard and Cornell universities. The goal was to uncover the Roman synagogue. What they found instead was a vast complex bathhouses, markets, and beneath one collapsed structure, the traces of something softer. You might expect the rediscovery of a library to come with great drama. A hidden vault, a scroll miraculously preserved, golden seal unbroken for centuries. But no, the scrolls were mostly gone. What remained were the tools, the imprint of a writing desk in charred wood, a row of clay inkpots, insides fused to glassy slicks by the heat, a stylus bent in half, a shard of pottery etched with a list of names. They weren't treasures. They were leftovers, the residue of thought. And yet, for those who studied the past, they were everything. Because while monuments can be rebuilt, while statues can be recast, the words people wrote, the things they bothered to copy, tell us what they cared about, what they feared, what they believed, what they had time to preserve, even as their cities crumbled. Sardis wasn't buried in one dramatic act. It faded slowly, each century adding a layer of dust, each war adding a crack in the stone, each generation forgetting a little more than the one before, until one day, the city was gone, and the mountain of ash, of earth, of memory stood where people had once read and written and walked. Tonight, as you rest your head and feel yourself floating toward sleep, imagine that burnt stylus in a scholar's hand. Picture the careful tracing of letters on a fragile scroll. Think of the wind outside the window, the flicker of oil lamplight, the scratch of ink against parchment. Those sounds are gone now, but the quiet they left behind is still here. And as we end this section, a question remains. What would they have written if they'd known no one would read it? If you wandered through the forgotten lanes of Sardis in the 7th century before the fire, before the earthquake, you might not have noticed anything remarkable. There were no grand temples under construction anymore, no royal palaces humming with messengers, no crowds at the amphitheater. The golden age had long since faded. Sardis, once a glittering capital of wealth and legend, had become a provincial town on the slow retreat of history. But that does not mean it was quiet. If you had listened closely, you might have heard something else. The low tap of hammering from the forge, the shuffle of sandals through colonnaded streets, the murmur of prayer in different tongues, Greek, Latin, Armenian, Syriac, a mother calling for her child from a shaded courtyard, and in a quieter corner through a narrow alley paved with uneven stone, the softest sound of all, the dry rustle of a scroll being opened. The library was not large, not public, not grand in the way of Alexandria or Ephesus, but it was deliberate, built, likely as part of a scholar's house or annexed to a community, building perhaps even a space tucked within the periphery of a synagogue. It served its purpose to keep memory alive, and memory, in this case, meant writing. But how does one write when empires rise and fall above your head? How does one store knowledge in a place where earthquakes are more common than festivals? You adapt. Sardian scribes and readers didn't preserve knowledge by building massive vaults. They preserved it in smaller, more ordinary ways, etched into wax tablets, scratched onto potsherds, keyed into parchment sheets, and stored in cubbies, in jars that could be closed when danger stirred. Not everything was written for prestige. Most of it was written because it was needed. Tax receipt for olive oil sold at the market. List of local names and birth dates, an inventory of dyes. Jars owned by a merchant woman. A portion of Isaiah's scroll copied for private use. These were the things found near the rubble charred, scattered, partially melted, but real. A stylus with one end chewed as if by nervous habit. A wax tablet still showing traces of scratched out arithmetic. A small ceramic ink pot sealed shut by time, its contents hardened like stone. The archaeologists who uncovered these fragments didn't announce a grand discovery. There was no global news story, no ceremonial unveiling. These objects were logged quietly, photographed, and placed in museum storage. But they tell us something no monument can. That people, real, ordinary people, kept writing. Even as Sardis fell into quiet decline, even as imperial borders shifted and neighbors disappeared, someone still woke up in the morning, lit a small lamp, and bent over a piece of parchment to copy something they believed was worth keeping. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't carved in marble. It was just life. That's what makes it matter. By the time the earthquake struck, likely around 616, Sardis was a shell of its former self. The city, nestled between mountain and river, had survived conquest, plague, political reform, and slow economic decay. And yet it endured. The Byzantine presence had transformed it yet again. Roman buildings were patched, reused. The great gymnasium and bath complex had long lost its original purpose. Mosaic floors were broken in places, repaired with care and inconsistency. The synagogue, remarkably, was still active, a sign of resilience in a region that had seen the tides of religion shift more than once. When the quake came, it did not discriminate. Roofs fell inward, walls crumbled, fires spread, not from malice, but from the way oil lamps tipped and cooking fires were left unattended in the chaos. What could not burn collapsed. What could burn did. The site of the scroll, fragments, and writing tools is believed to have been buried then. Whether the scholar or scribe survived, we cannot know. What we do know is what was left behind, that blackened layer of soil. What archaeologists call a burn layer marks a very specific moment, one where time paused. Above it, a new era began. Below it, an old world lay sealed, untouched for over 1,000 years. For a long time, Sardis slept. Sand and soil accumulated. Rains washed down sediment from the mountain. Grasses took root. Whole houses disappeared under green humps and dust. By the time medieval travelers passed nearby, the city was no longer on the maps. The Lydian kings were reduced to legend. The library, never large to begin with, was forgotten altogether. No stone marked its location. No sign remained above ground. Only earth. The rediscovery of Sardis began in earnest in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But it wasn't until 1958 that the Harvard Cornell excavation project began a systematic dig. Year after year, with small tools and patient hands, they peeled away the centuries. The synagogue was a surprise. Its preservation was remarkable. Its floor mosaics, still glinting with color after 1,300 years in darkness. Next to it were Roman shops, bath complexes, and traces of medieval reconstruction. And in the shadow of all this, somewhere modest and half collapsed, they found the writing tools. It is important to say this. No complete scroll was found. That's the mystery. That's what makes it feel so ordinary and so profound. Just fragments, burnt, bits of parchment, clay jars that once held ink, the heavy lid of a writing desk, stylus broken cleanly in half. Some were found lodged between bricks, others buried in collapsed earth. One object, a stone weight used to hold parchment flatwise, found beside the footings of a wall that no longer stood. They were not buried as treasure. They were left behind in a moment of panic, and perhaps that is what makes them feel so human. There's something sobering about the things people choose to survive, the things they leave behind. You might expect gold to survive, or statues, but it's often the most delicate things that remain. A child's toy, a letter never sent, a stylus burned at one end. In Sardis, the library's fragments tell a quiet story, not of kings, or war, or conquest, but of ordinary minds at work, copying, recording, thinking, remembering. No one built a mountain over Sardis. No one came with shovels and buried it in one grand act. But time did what time always does. It layered. Rains fell. Silt gathered walls. Collapsed. Grasses grew. Shepherds walked over what used to be libraries, and the world forgot, until one day someone dug, and in the dirt they found memory. Burned. Yes, but not erased. So the question remains, gently unanswered. If no one remembers your name, but they find the mark of your pen, did you still matter? When you peer into a library buried under ash, you aren't just peering into a room, you're peering into time, sealed in sediment, and not a loud or dramatic time either. A quiet one. A day like any other. A scroll half opened. List half checked. A reader pausing midway through a verse because something distracted them, and they never came back. In the aftermath of the Sardis quake, no great scribes are recorded to have lamented the library's destruction. No imperial decree called for its restoration. Simply ... ceased. The silence was immediate, and yet, strangely, the story didn't end there, because buried things have a tendency to whisper. Not loudly, just gently, insistently, as though reminding us, I was here. For centuries, Sardis was only spoken of in half memory. Travelers mentioned ruins near the Hermes River, but few stayed long. The names of Lydian kings were confused with myths. Even the city's location became debatable. Was Sardis closer to the sea or further inland? Had it been a Greek stronghold or a Persian capital? People disagreed. They argued not just about what had been buried, but whether it had ever been real to begin with. And that too is part of the erosion that time brings. Not only of stone, but of certainty. But stone can be uncovered. Certainty can be restitched, one pottery shard at a time. And in the case of Sardis, it was the archaeologists, not the poets, who became the city's final readers. Their work was slow, gentle, a brushstroke here, a fingertip there. They didn't find a great golden tomb. They found floors, walls, trash pits, foundation stones, reused across centuries, and tucked among them, the library's ghost. Not a single name associated with the scroll room has survived. Not a single portrait, but the tools did, in a small trench beside what had been a late Roman building. The team discovered a cluster of objects: burned styluses, pots, writing weights, and bits of parchment, so fragile they dissolved when exposed to air. A few were preserved in waxy carbon. One showed the faintest trace of Greek script, barely legible, but enough to confirm someone had been writing. The letters, when transcribed, amounted to half a word. Possibly the name of a prophet. Possibly a grocery list. That's the frustrating beauty of ruined libraries. You never quite know what you found. But the absence, in its own way, speaks. You see, most ancient cities leave behind clear evidence of their beliefs, temples, icons, altars, statues. Sardis did too. But this little writing room, scorched and barren, suggests something different. It suggests an everyday practice of preservation. Not for ceremony, but for memory. This wasn't writing for glory. It was writing for continuity. A merchant writing letters to his brother in another town. A teacher preparing a lesson on the Psalms. A scribe making notes from older documents. Not because he wanted fame, but because someone had to do it. And what makes this all the more remarkable is that it survived. Not the content, much of that is gone, but the context, the soot, the placement. The deliberate way tools were organized before the disaster struck. In one corner of the trench, near the threshold, the archaeologists found a small jar embedded in collapsed stone. Inside it were 3 styluses. One had a cracked tip, as if dropped. Another had a carved ring of thread, still clinging to its middle. The third was longer, heavier perhaps, belonging to someone older, more experienced. There was no plaque, no commemorative name. Just a toolkit. It's forgotten, and yet perfectly preserved. And isn't that the story of so many lives? They pass, leave nothing but wear marks on stone, indentations and benches. A groove carved into a door frame from being opened too many times. In Sardis, these grooves were everywhere, but it took centuries to see them again. Let's pause here and ask, why was Sardis so thoroughly forgotten? It wasn't buried in ash like Pompeii. It wasn't washed away by flood or lost under jungle vines. Yet, for a long time, it might as well have been. The answer lies not in catastrophe, but in relevance. Sardis was simply no longer needed. Trade routes shifted. Religious power centers moved. The Byzantines focused their energies on other cities, newer ones, coastal ones. Sardis became quiet. And in time, quietness turned into disappearance. Its buildings crumbled, not all at once, but over decades. People dismantled the temples for stone. Colonnade became a quarry. The grand bathhouse became a sheepfold. The synagogue's marble was recut and carried off. The library room, forgotten under layers of earth, charcoal, and reoccupation, until only the hill remained, a shapeless rise in the land, covered in grasses. Locals built houses nearby. They knew ruins were underfoot, but few knew what they were. It wasn't until aerial photography in the 20th century, followed by the systematic Harvard Cornell digs, that the contours of Sardis began to reveal themselves again. But the library, that remained a whisper. Only those small clues, a bit of writing charcoal, a half-burned reed pen, a stone, ankstand, and in those quiet objects, the suggestion that someone, centuries ago, thought it was worth copying down words no one else would see. It's tempting, at this point, to imagine what those scribes hoped for. Did they believe they were preserving truth for future generations? Or were they just doing a job? Copying by candlelight, rubbing their eyes, repeating phrases without ever quite understanding them. We'll never know. And maybe that's the point. Because sometimes the preservation of knowledge isn't about what the words say. It's about the fact that someone took the time to write them at all. And here, buried beneath layers of dust and sorrow, someone, did a person who saw the world shrinking around them, who lived in a city once royal, now provincial land, who still believed that some things to be written down, even if no one read them, even if the room burned, even if the earth swallowed the walls, they still wrote. And now, centuries later, we listen, not to the words, but to the echo. the faint breath of ink on parchment, long vanished, but not forgotten. So now you know, the mountain wasn't built overnight. Sardis disappeared, not in fire or war, but in silence. And yet, beneath the dirt, a library slept, not a grand one,